Hello, everybody, and welcome to Contextual Christianity. My name is Daniel Donahue, and I'm certainly glad you're here. Today's video, we're going to be addressing the question on who the early Christian writers are. A lot of people have a lot of confusion on the early church. And a lot of people don't even want to approach the early church in terms of literature because they find it too overwhelming to approach, which is rather unfortunate because the early church is an extraordinarily valuable resource for Christians to grow deeper in their relationship with God. In one sense, we as Christians today, has been said so many times, it's almost cliche, are standing on the shoulders of giants and thinking we are flying. Who we are today has a lineage, has a history, and that history starts back with a group of Christians that came after the apostles. Now, I have devoted a lot of my life to studying the early church, specifically the Ante-Nicene church fathers and the subset within that, the Nicene fathers. But I have a major appreciation for the early church. Now, many today, they're only going to be focusing on post-Reformation history. They're not going to be looking at any church fathers that came prior to that. And that's unfortunate. Maybe they'll turn to Augustine and look at him and not even look at anybody else. Maybe they'll address some of the councils, and that's about it. The early church fathers are an extraordinary blessing to study, yet for whatever reason, we've avoided it. Maybe because we don't think we're going to agree with it. Maybe we're afraid of it. Or maybe because we think it's too big. It's really not. So let us go over who the early church was, the categories they're in, and how we can actually study them in a way that is manageable. So with that said, let's start with the beginning. So the early church, frankly, started with the apostles, but right after the apostles, or actually during the apostles' life, we have the beginning of a different category of written documents. These are Christian documents that are contemporary or just after the apostles, yet are not verbally inspired. They're not inspired in the same way by the Holy Spirit as the New Testament was. This group I would put as early as 40 to 50 AD and go to around 190 AD. And this first group is called the Apostolic Fathers. Now, a lot of people are going to debate on who is inside the Apostolic Fathers and what exactly the Apostolic Fathers are. Once again, these are the people that have a very close connection to the apostles in ministry, possibly knowing the apostles or were taught under the apostles, and in one case was a disciple of one of the apostles. And that's how I categorize it. So the earliest document that I would say that's in this, now this is debated again, is the Didache. The Didache I place around 40 to 50 AD, possibly 60 AD, but it was a contemporary with the apostles. Now, some people put a later date to this. I don't see it that way. I see that this has the flavor and the way it is written seems very early Christianity in terms of some of the vocabulary words that are used and some of the nuances kind of disappear in later writing. Now, with that said, still some will actually put this in the 2nd or 3rd century. I can't see it. I don't see it. I think that this is very early, and a lot of good scholars agree on that position. So that is kind of one of the first documents inside the Apostolic Fathers. It's called the Didache, otherwise known as the Teaching of the 12. I don't necessarily think it was written by the 12 apostles, but I think it would have been taken from their ministries and applied to other churches. And it kind of gives a practical sense for new Christians, specifically Gentile Christians, in coming to faith. It's a wonderful document. After that, you have kind of the big three: Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp, and Clement of Rome. Now, these three are fantastic. And there's a lot of written text still from these guys that are around. I mean, we have 7 letters from Clement. Unfortunately, not of Clement, we have 7 letters from Ignatius of Antioch. We only have 1 surviving letter of Clement. There are 2 other letters attributed called 1st and 2nd Clement. I would say that those are forgeries put in his name, and many other people believe so as well. Then you have Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. In fact, many of these knew the disciples. But Polycarp lived well into his 80s, possibly, depending on how you read his martyrdom, even into his 90s. And he was basically a bridge from the apostles all the way into the mid-2nd century, almost 3rd century, in terms of his influence. Because one of his disciples was Irenaeus. And Irenaeus lived to about 190 AD, roughly, and learned under Polycarp. And Irenaeus basically indicates that Polycarp only taught what he had learned from the apostles. So he's really derived his stuff from an oral tradition of the apostles. He's not just reinterpreting the text. So he's a great resource, and I would therefore, once again, some are going to disagree with me, I would put Irenaeus inside the apostolic fathers. Others in this group, you have the Didache, you have the Epistle of Barnabas, you'll have the Shepherd of Hermas, though I really think the Shepherd of Hermas is kind of garbage. I know that's maybe not the right thing to say. I think it's a later document, 2nd century, not 1st century, and I think that it has some really odd teaching in it. But that's kind of primarily the apostolic fathers. Once again, that's kind of a subset of what is called the Ante-Nicene church fathers. Well, what is the Ante-Nicene fathers? Well, they're the pre-Nicene fathers, the ones that came into or writing documents down prior to the Nicene controversy or the Nicene Creed. So around 325. Now there's going to be overlap because people live different lengths of time. And so there's going to be some that are starting their written text prior to 325. And then there's going to be some that are maybe stretch over. But this is an incredible body of literature. And that's the Ante-Nicene church fathers right there. That's not all of them. Other things have been discovered since that collection is put together. Like in 1906, we have Irenaeus' demonstration of the apostolic preaching, which is a fantastic read. I've read and studied it numerous times, gone over it quite a bit. I find it to be one of the most important church documents that we have. And it's not even in that collection. So, and then there's some things from Origen that we've discovered. There's other documents that are not there. But this is the bulk of the material that has come from around 40 to 50 AD to around 325 AD. That's incredible. That's incredible. I mean, that is the material we have. And it's an important part of ministry because we learn so much about, the Bible through those texts. There's information in there that illuminates confusing portions of Scripture. Now, once we get to around 325, in that area, 313 maybe, we're moving into a different time period of the church. And the reason that is because prior to 325, there was a great deal of persecution. Actually, prior to 313. And after 313, Christianity actually becomes officially legal. It's no longer illegal to practice Christianity. And around 325, you have this controversy that is splitting the church and is brought together through a council. And all these leaders of the church come together and they start well, coming up with what is truth. Is Arianism correct, or is Trinitarian theology correct? It's that homoousios versus homoiousios controversy. It's is Jesus or is the Son of God the same substance of the Father or not? Now, this time period, specifically Constantine, becomes the boogeyman to a lot of heretical sects inside Christianity. Part of the reason why is this is a transitional time. The church was underground and now it's no longer. And therefore they see some of the practices that come later out of this, and they say, that's when the church went bad. It was great before and it was great after, but Constantine and his council and mixed Roman theology. And then next you have the two Babylons with Hislop and all this funky conspiracy theorist stuff that has been crept into a lot of fringe churches. They'll say state religion started then at the Council of Nicene. No, that came roughly 50 years later. Christianity became the state religion. So, which, yes, is a problem. And there were abuses that came later out of this. But this point becomes really a break for some, basically trying to make a boogeyman of this time to push a fringe doctrine. Like, the reason why we aren't teaching the same as most other churches is because of Constantine. And they'll point to him. Which, if you hear Constantine becoming a boogeyman in your church, that's a good time you should probably consider changing churches, because that's not a good thing. So, what exactly is different? Well, in this body of work, the church is no longer underground, and they're dealing with the Nicene controversy. And they're dealing with Christology in a way that hasn't been dealt with before. So a lot of Christocentric doctrines are really being put on the forefront that weren't really being addressed prior to that, because the controversy that was before that, a lot of the controversies that were in the church weren't really being addressed because you're persecuted. When you're being persecuted, usually you can unite over the fact that you're a solidified group, but once persecution ends, the groups tend to fracture. And that's what happened around 313, is the group started to fracture because they were like, that's not us. There were controversies and heresies prior to this. I mean, you have Sabellianism, you have Monticism, you have Gnosticism, but this one right here almost divided the church. Well, some of the other one, Gnosticism, almost did the same, but this one almost divided the church, Arianism. In fact, it was a major controversy that came about. And depending on what you believed, you could be persecuted for the next several generations after that if you were maybe semi-Arian, or you held kind of a different view. And depending on who was emperor, made it safe or not to preach Trinitarian doctrine. After that, you have the post-Nicene church fathers, also dealing with they're dealing in other councils, and there's other disputes, still a lot of Christological things being dealt. And I would say that the early church kind of ends with, I would say, John of Damascus, St. John of Damascus, around the 8th century AD. Some people might end it a little sooner. I don't really think anybody ends it a little later. But that's basically the early church and who they are. Now, that only gets you so far, because when it comes to the early church, it's not just where they are in time and sequence, but it's also region. Region plays a significant role on this as well. Particular if you are an Eastern father versus a Western father. So Rome was kind of divided into two. You had the Eastern Roman half and you had the Western Roman half. And the Eastern Roman half primarily spoke Greek, while the Western primarily spoke Latin. And you had very much a Latin culture on one side and a Greek culture on the other. And this flavored really certain practices within the church, and it also flavored how people understood vocabulary and could really come up with the correct vocabulary with inside church doctrine. Because if you don't have the right vocabulary, you can't describe something properly. And there's a huge gap between Greek and Latin sometimes when it comes to understanding and categorizing certain words. In fact, Latin started borrowing terms from the Greek because of that reason. Now, this divide came a little bit later because even the early Western fathers primarily spoke Greek or wrote down Greek. We see this with Irenaeus. I mean, he is from the East originally. He moved over to Lyon or Lugdunum later on. So that's something to understand. But over time, it did create a certain amount of difference that ultimately divided the church. You have Eastern Orthodoxy, and then you have Catholicism. That's the divide. And that happened in the 11th century, 1054 AD. So that's the two major camps and divides. But it also can be divided in another few ways, which is what see the church was under, or what region is a better way of looking at it. See is a kind of very, most Protestants don't use that term, but see it works as well. So what region a church is in. So there's, I would say, primary 5 regions, maybe 6 or 7, depending on the way you look at it. The primary 5 you would have were you have Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. Rome, the only one on the west. Maybe you can add Carthage. I would put Carthage as a secondary, but Rome kind of engulfs everything west. On the east, you have Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and then when Constantinople became Constantinople and became the seat and the capital of Rome, you have Constantinople, which gained prominence then. Now, of those cities, they had different prominence at different time. In fact, these two traditions still recognize and still hold and are very fond of Constantinople, the new capital of Rome, and Rome itself, the old capital. And therefore, what makes sense is power, regional power becomes where the capital is. It's very pragmatic. I mean, the Catholics and the Greek Orthodox, they put a lot of stock in location, but those locations are very historically convenient because they're the power center. Oh, an apostle died here. Therefore, we have the seat of the spiritual kingdom. Yada, yada, yada. Great stuff. Thanks a lot. 2,000 years later. But, I mean, the Vatican's beautiful. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the Vatican's beautiful. But do they have complete papal authority over all Christendom? I would say it's a little too convenient for me, historically speaking, just based on human nature. Obviously, that's why that happened. However, early on, 2 of the most prominent cities were Alexandria and Antioch. And this is very important for us to understand. These two cities are very important because what takes place in these 2 cities is really puts a lot of weight on how we actually interpret the Bible. So in these 2 cities, we have a rivalry. And this rivalry plays out for hundreds of years. And a rivalry based on authority, regional authority, like I was already saying. They wanted it too. They're like, hey, we're here. But hermeneutical authority. Do you interpret the Bible from a spiritual and allegorical sense, or from a more literal or grammatical, historical grammatical sense? There was a divide between these 2 cities. If you were in the area of Alexandria, you would tend to interpret the Bible from a very allegorical sense. Now, they would interpret it literal in places, but a lot of places they would spiritualize. Now, why is that? Well, one of the largest influences at this time period, Athens was no longer the intellectual dominant place in the world. It was Alexandria with the Alexandrian Library. That's where Greek thought was taking place. And one of the key Greek thinkers around this time was Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jewish philosopher who basically merged Judaism with Greek Platonic thought, married them together, and kind of picked up a hermeneutical system that enveloped a certain amount of allegorical and spiritual interpretation. That Philo's influence became very big on the early church. Very big, especially in that region. I mean, you see it when you pick up Eusebius. You can see his respect for Philo of Alexandria. And you can see the respect the early Alexandrian Christians had for Greeks. I mean, when you read Clement of Alexandria, he's almost elevating the Greek philosophers to the same place of the Old Testament. Not quite, but it's pretty close. That was what was taking place. And so a foreign type of hermeneutic was placed over the biblical or interpretive process. While in Antioch, you have something different. They take a more literal interpretive scheme. Now, I say literal, I mean, obviously there's metaphors, and anybody that says, well, is Jesus a door? Because it's you're taking it literally. No, you're using parts of speech. You're understanding the grammar and the linguistic rules for that language and interpreting it how the original with the original authorial intent in mind. So the Antiochian tradition is much more literal. Did they allegorize at times? Yes, but so did Paul. So I'm not against allegory, but what I'm saying is you allegorize when it's appropriate and when it's there. We don't make up allegories. You don't make up an allegory just because you have a problem with a doctrine or something. You have a problem with a text and you're going to try to spiritualize it away. So you have a far more literal interpretive process. Now, Antioch was the main city, but I think this really came about because of the influence of the Apostle John. John the Apostle lived a very long life. He lived well into his 90s, and he basically was able to influence the church of Asia Minor and the surrounding area, which would that he died around Ephesus, the city of Ephesus, and the other churches around there like Smyrna, Pergamum, all kind of came under his wing. You also see that Jerusalem, those churches kind of were heavily influenced by John's ministry, and people that started in that area and then left to different regions in the West were also influenced by John's ministry. Think of a great example would be Irenaeus. He has a very Johannian John interpretive scheme on it, and he's actually against a lot of allegories. I mean, book 5 of his Against Heresy basically says that we should not have any unnecessary allegorization. So I paraphrase that, by the way. You can read it. So that's kind of the rift between these two groups. You have a church that wants to spiritualize things, and you have a church that doesn't. And this continues for hundreds of years. Once again, it's a rivalry. They're trying to find the Catholic Church, which is the unified church. Catholic is not a bad word. It's not a dirty word. It just means the universal church. They're trying to understand the hermeneutics of the universal church, and these two cities are at a dividing point on this. And so even in the 4th, 5th century, you can see this divide. With the whole Nestorian controversy is almost a controversy between these two cities. The whole a lot of other controversies as well. And you can see the literal hermeneutic of Antioch within John Chrysostom, who was in the late 300s at that time period. So this is important because the fact is Alexandria won out. Alexandria won the day. Antioch lost. And so on certain subjects and certain things inside Christianity today, specifically in Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, you have a hermeneutical process that came from Alexandria. And the problem I have with that is that process came from Philo, who adopted it from the Greeks. So it's a foreign hermeneutical system that was brought into Christianity from an outside source. And the other fathers, they had a problem with it. This isn't like something that they didn't address. I mean, Tertullian basically said, what is Athens, the representation of Greek philosophy, even though it's now in Alexandria? What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Now, what I'm not saying, though, is that we shouldn't use other thought. I mean, there are truths found in Greek philosophy. All truths are God's truth. So when a Greek philosopher finds something that is true, we should hold on to it, but we don't invite or put on his system. So that's an important thing to understand. So with all that said, that is kind of a basic introduction to the early church and understanding where someone is in terms of where they're located and in what generation they are. They're going to have certain presuppositions at play. And as we continue this series on the early church, we're going to be addressing, okay, how do we as Protestants read the early church? What value should we place on the early church? And how these different doctrines play out. How do we sift through the different presuppositions of the different time periods and the different regions? And I'm going to kind of walk through each one of these different categories so that each one of you guys will know how to read any of the early church father. And that's kind of important because I want to make this as simple as possible so that you're able to approach the early church fathers in a way where you are, well, able to grow in Christ. So with that said, my name is Daniel Donahue. This is Contextual Christianity. Thanks for tuning in. Have a fantastic day.